mentioned to you in the notes not to worry so much about the textbook, but just to focus on the notes and at least try to read those just to get an idea of what we're talking about here. Anytime you have a teacher that skips certain chapters, don't necessarily take that to mean that those chapters aren't important. What you should take it to mean is that it's not as important to that teacher as it might be to somebody else. Personally, there's stuff in these chapters that I find interesting, but in terms of the overall stuff we need to cover, there's other things that I enjoy more and think are more important, so I tend to skim over these. You might find that these are your two favorite chapters in the whole book and be frustrated with me for skipping over them. So that's why you go on and take another class in history with somebody else that spends time on it. So anyway, I apologize, but we had to combine something because we didn't have enough weeks to be able to have a week for every single chapter. So you guys are at least getting something from 10 and 12. My online classes aren't getting anything. We're completely skipping them in the online classes. So anyway. Chapter 10 focuses more on it's kind of the same time period as stuff we've already covered. It's not moving forward chronologically, but it's just sort of filling in some of the gaps in terms of population growth and what was happening with the economy. So part of the reason why these two chapters can be skipped is because you're not skipping chronological segments. You're just skipping things that were happening during those same time periods. So anyway, the first part of this, the notes talk about immigration and the fact that the immigration was tremendous in the middle 1800s, and then especially when you get into the late 1800s, which you would cover in American history too. We were letting millions of people come into the country. There weren't a whole lot of restrictions. That changes in the late 1800s because people really start to get frustrated with the number of people coming in. And again, what's the main reason people don't like immigrants?
They're taking good jobs.
Because they'll work for less money, and so they take jobs, but they also bring wages down because they're willing to work for less generally than people who live here. So, I mean, there are some valid reasons why people feel that way, but sometimes it's the whole throw the baby out with the bathwater thing. I mean, do you get rid of all immigration just because of that, or are there other ways to deal with it? And that's going to be, we're going to deal with that. Well, we'll all be long dead when we're still struggling with that issue. So at this particular point in time, though, most of the immigrants were coming from Western Europe. So when you get into the late 1800s, it starts becoming Eastern Europe, and there's a whole lot of, I mean, there's not as much racism toward these people because we still think of them as being our heritage because most of us came from Western Europe. But when we start looking at people coming from Eastern Europe, it really starts to get bad in terms of the racism that develops. Even then, which groups in this time period were looked down upon more? Because you can see here Irish. That they were coming from Ireland and Germany.
Irish.
Yeah, the Irish were the ones who were considered, they were poor, they were low class, and what else about them?
Drunks.
Most of them they considered to be a bunch of drunks. And what religion are they?
Catholic.
Catholic. Yes. And that was not real popular yet here in the United States. So people from Ireland, which I'm Irish, so I'm right in there with them, were not looked highly upon, and they were considered to be taking those jobs, willing to work for nothing basically. So we start to see that kind of discrimination toward them. What was one of the main reasons why people came from Ireland?
They were having that potato famine.
Yeah, the potato famine in Ireland, which is crazy to think that they didn't even have potatoes before Columbus discovered America. And then they became so dependent upon them that when the potato crop failed, I mean, literally, there was over 1 million people who starved to death in Ireland.
Wow.
Starved to death just because the potato crop failed.
So that was the only thing that they were...
That was like their main staple crop that they used as the staple part of their diet. And then you can see also why the Irish hated the British, because the British didn't really come to their aid when they were all starving to death. So there's all kinds of other history there too. So anyway, very interesting period in Irish history, but then also obviously many of them ended up here. And where did the Irish settle for the most part here in the States?
The coast.
East Coast, right? Many of them in New York City itself. We got a very large Irish population in Boston as well. Where did most of the Germans settle?
They went to the west.
Well, west meaning more like Midwest at that point in time. Have you ever heard of the Pennsylvania Dutch? Are they Dutch? What are they?
German.
The Pennsylvania Dutch are German. So why do we call them the Pennsylvania Dutch? Seems kind of stupid, doesn't it?
Sounds right.
How do you spell German in German?
Deutsch.
Dutch.
T-E-U-T-S-C-H.
Or D-E-U-S-H.
Hold on. I was gonna spell it out loud.
D-E-U-S-H. Oh.
Yeah, D-E-U-T-S-C-H.
C-H?
Yes,
All right, say that.
Deutsch.
What's that sound like to you?
Dutch, yeah.
So it was the Deutsch that came to Pennsylvania, and they thought they were calling themselves Dutch, and so we refer to them as the Pennsylvania Dutch, but they're actually the Germans who came and settled
When I
there.
watch some of the shows on History Channels and stuff about the, like the Amish people and the Dutch people up there, or whatever they consider that, in that area, they do speak German, and I do, I understand it. And when people speak Dutch, I can only get a few words here and there, but,
Yeah.
so that makes sense.
So anyway, if you look up here, you can see the population of the U.S. This is pretty much when Washington becomes president, after we had won the Revolutionary War. We had 4 million people. 30 years later, that's 2.5 times the population in just 30 years. And then only 10 more years, and it increased by another 3 million, then 4 million, and then between 1840 and 1850, 6 million people, and a lot of that is immigration, because that's where the Irish and the Germans are coming. So the population is growing significantly in this time period, and we're starting to move more toward manufacturing, and many of these, especially the Irish immigrants, are coming and willing to work in those factories for like nothing. We do start to see what is referred to as nativism, which is basically we're Americans, even though we forget that maybe we just got here 50 years ago, but oh, we're Americans now, and we start discriminating against these other people because, you know, they're coming in and stealing our jobs, and especially those that are Catholic. Catholics were really looked down upon in this particular period. Protestant was associated with being American. Catholic was foreign, and we didn't like that. It's also, you know, again, we've covered some of this time period in terms of presidents and things that were going on, but this is kind of taking a step back and looking what's happening in the country in terms of transportation. Of course, you're building more roads because you're moving into the West, but that's not really the key to this. The key to the transportation revolution are the canals and the railroads. We can't really understand what canals meant to this country in the 1800s, but they were huge in terms of being able to move product, especially product, because of the weight of the product, to move that more quickly and to move products from the east to the west. Now, when I say east to the west, I mean east coast to, like, you know, not beyond the Mississippi, but even to like Cincinnati and then some of those areas. So the canal system really takes off in mainly the 1830s. And railroads are just starting to be laid, but we don't have many tracks, and I think I mentioned last week that the tracks are all different sizes and they don't match up, so you might have one track of 10 miles here and one 10 miles here, but they don't connect. And even if you try to connect them, you're going to have to completely rip up this set so it matches this set. Not real smart the way that they did that to begin with. As I said before, women should have been involved. But and then steamboats. Steamboats are huge. Why are steamboats so important in this period? What do they allow you to do that you could never do before?
Travel on the rivers?
Which way? upriver, upstream. Before this, you couldn't do that. So you always had to travel the waterways the way that the current was flowing. Now you can go any way you want. I mean, it seems so simple to us, but now these people become masters of the waterways. They can actually dictate exactly what they want to do instead of like, oh man, I got to go all the way in this big circle again because there's no other way to do it. I mean, steamboats really changed shipping, manufacturing, all of that kind of stuff in this time period. But there's one big problem with steamboats. What is it? They blow up. Not a real good thing, right? You know, until they kind of fine-tuned them, that was a pretty major risk that you were taking, because a lot of them, because of the engines and stuff, they would blow up. So, you know, you got to kind of take that into consideration. But these are all major changes that are happening in this period. Like, just for example, with the canal system. Just look at this comparison. By road, it would take 4 horses. They could pull 1.5 tons, 18 miles a day. So you load everything up on the wagons, and those horses on the roads can take 1.5 tons of product, and they can only go 18 miles. By canal, the same 4 horses can pull 100 tons. So they can pull so much more that on one load, they can take all of that stuff and be able to sell it in that new market. Plus, they can go 24 miles as opposed to the 18. So look what it does to the shipping cost. The only problem you had is you had to teach the horses how to swim. I could tell. You know how canals work, seriously? You know, the horses walk alongside and they have a rope attached to the barge and they just pull the barge down, but because the barge is in the water, it just floats as long as the horse, you know, you get the horse moving and he can pull it.
So how wide were these canals? Just like enough for going both ways, or were they mainly really wide?
Being from Cincinnati, there's a whole canal system all around Cincinnati, and there's some old canals that you can still go and see, and they still have some of the locks in place and stuff like that. And I've done that before, not really until after I had studied some of this stuff, because I didn't really understand it all. But once you've kind of studied it, it's like, wow, I want to go see that. So I would say the one I saw was probably about as wide as this room. So I'm not even sure if they could have one going both ways. I guess it would depend on how wide the barges were, but they weren't that wide. I mean, there may be a standard width that I'm not remembering, but just, you know, trying to visually remember what I saw. Not if it was wider than this room, it wasn't much. And then obviously the Erie Canal, I'm sure we all have heard of it. It's the most famous of all of them. One of the reasons why it's so famous is because it was one of the first to really be completed. And then the fact that within this was a very expensive project and very dangerous project, because an awful lot of men died building this thing, mostly from disease, because you're having to dig all this stuff out, and there's mosquitoes and malaria set in and everything else. So, but within 7 years, they had paid it off just from the tolls that they were able to collect. And that was a huge success. So it led to other places being willing to do more of this because of what happened here. And many of them would split off from the Erie. So the Erie had their particular canal, and then there were all these offshoots of it that took you into other smaller areas. So most people at first thought it was just going to be a complete joke. I mean, this guy was made fun of, the governor, and he was the one laughing all the way to the bank later, I'm sure. So between 1820 and 1840, we spent over $200 million investing in canal building. Now remember, we talked before about internal improvements and who should pay for them. And the American system that we talked about with Henry Clay, one of his big things was we need to have a better infrastructure. And he wanted the federal government to pay for this. The federal government didn't want to do that. And so this was a battle that went on for decades as to who should have to pay for this type of thing. Most of this was done by the states. They finally just said, forget it, we're going to do something. I mean, the federal government's not going to help us. We're going to go ahead and build these things and start being able to make some money ourselves. So they ended up covering the cost of most of these. Railroads, early years, not very successful, as we've already talked about, but by 1860, they had become extremely important in the United States. But again, where are most of the railroads? Which part of the country? Which region?
East.
East? And what else? North or south?
South.
South.
West.
Okay, why is this not working for us? There we go.
We'll just keep guessing until we get it.
Sorry about this stupid thing, but it gives you an idea. Can you tell?
In the north.
Why would they be in the north? Where's all the factories? In the north. All the manufacturing that's going to start taking place is taking place in the north, because what are we doing in the south?
Farming.
And what are we farming?
Cotton.
Cotton by this point, right? Some tobacco, some rice, but mostly cotton. So they do have some railroads to be able to move cotton to different places, but not a whole lot. And why is this important as we get into the 1850s? What's going to be significant about where the railroads are? What happens in the 1860s?
So,
Civil War. So why do railroads matter in the Civil War?
troops.
The troops and the
Transport equipment, troops, everything else. So the North is going to have a tremendous advantage when it comes to transportation, except for, where does most of the fighting take place? In the South. So the North can get their stuff from up in the north down to right about where the fighting is going to happen, but in terms of getting stuff down into the lower South, they're still going to have trouble just like the southern states are. But the South is definitely going to have trouble because they don't have much of a transportation system at all. Canals, railroads, anything. So it is very difficult for them to be able to move things that they need. This talks also about communications in terms of, again, how do we communicate in this time period? I mean, we don't have radio and television, any of that kind of stuff. So it's mostly newspapers, right? Newspapers and journals and things like that. But you can see, oh, you can't see that, can you? Newspapers are going to become extremely important in this time period. And you can see here that circulation rose from 376 papers in 1810 to 1,258 different newspapers across the country. Circulation of 90 million people. Not 90 million people, I guess, but 90 million papers that were being sold in this time period. Again, but most of those are in the north. So there's a lot more communication, a lot more people that are educated, that are interested in the news, those kinds of things. That's also going to be a factor as we start talking about the Civil War. Telegraph is invented. Very first message is sent in 1844. So telegraph is going to also be important in the Civil War. It's going to be one of the key ways of communicating as long as you have telegraph lines to be able to do that. But we'll talk more about that later. So in terms of what they refer to as the market revolution, you've got these three different factors. You have the transportation revolution, which we've already been talking about. The idea of commercialization, meaning people are now thinking more about producing stuff for the market, not just for their own home consumption. It's a whole mentality change that's taking place in our society at this point in time. And then obviously that's powered by industrialization that can produce those products on a higher scale than they used to. putting out system refers to the prostitutes that they hire to service the guess not.
Do you have some pain medicine before you came in today?
Did you see the headline in like the Philadelphia Philadelphia newspaper where it said, pimp is tired of the grind? Like talking about like how he's tired of like working as a pimp, but the headline is, pimp is tired of the grind.
Really?
Like, that's the worst headline. The grind.
How did you see that?
I have family in Philly. My
Oh,
cousin
oh,
sent it
okay.
to me. He's like, look at this headline. I'm like, only you.
That is pretty horrible. Anyway, this section, I'm not going to go through all this, but this section talks about going from just people that would produce things in their home to sell them, to early industrialization, to more of actual factories. It's a whole process, because keep in mind, the Industrial Revolution takes place in England first. We don't get really into the Industrial Revolution until about 100 years after they do. Wish we'd learned more from them, because they had like the worst slums and the worst working conditions in the world. You would have thought we would have done something better than that, but we didn't really learn much. So anyway, this just talks about some of the new mills or factories here. We actually did steal a lot of information from Britain. Back when Jefferson was president, remember the embargo of 1807? One of the good things about that embargo was it did force us to begin doing our own manufacturing, where instead of relying on Britain to supply those goods. This is kind of, have any of you ever seen any of this on the History Channel, talking about the Lowell mills? How they tried to set up these mills that were going to be like these the perfect working condition for good, wholesome farm girls. To be able to leave the farms and come and work in the factories and make money for their families. And they had dormitories, they had curfews, they had all these rules, chaperones if they went anywhere, so that families could feel comfortable sending their young girls off, to work in the city in these factories. And it was supposed to be the example to the world of how this can be done. Well, it lasted about 2 minutes, and then it started to go downhill. And a lot of that was because people wanted to pay them less and less money because they're girls, they're not men, and the girls didn't want to be that good. They wanted to just be normal, girls that could go out and have fun at night, and all kinds of different things happened. But eventually, the experiment kind of went out the window, and they just became regular factories, and the girls' families had to decide if it was worth sending them to those places. But, it's supposed to be like this utopia that never quite worked out that way. This next section just talks about how often, because they paid so little, you had to have whole families that would work, and you would actually have mom, dad, and the kids working in the factory, and these kids could be little, like 5, 6 years old, working in these factories. We've heard those stories, and it gets worse in the late 1800s because we become more and more of a manufacturing country, and that ends up happening. Interchangeable parts, what's that refer to? What does that mean when somebody uses that term?
Something broken, fix it.
Like a contract to make or buy phones.
Yeah. What's a good example of something that you own that you rely upon interchangeable parts?
Car.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's probably the number one thing, right? I mean, what would it be like if the water pump went out on your car and you just had to throw the car away? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? Well, that's kind of the way things were back then. Almost everything that was made was custom made in the 1700s. And it's not until, well, England was starting to do that in the 1700s, but here in America, it wasn't until the 1800s that we began to realize that you could make 50 guns and make them all exactly the same if you made every part with the same specifications, right? And then it wouldn't necessarily matter. I don't know anything about guns. What are the parts of guns?
Trigger.
Yeah, those things. Yeah. So if something goes, bad on this one, you could just grab the same part that you've made 50 of and put it on there and you could fix it. So it sounds simple to us, right? Well, duh, of course that's what you should do. But America was the country that really came up with this. We're the ones who came up with the concept of it and began to make things. My dad was actually a machinist, and he had to make things, parts for stuff he would come home and tell me about how he had to cut something to, this 1/8 of a millimeter or something, and if he messed it up, he'd have to throw it away and scrap it, and he'd get all frustrated, and he'd get yelled at because he just had wasted something, and how he had to be, like, perfect. But, the machine does most of it for you. You just have to set the machine appropriately. So we're the ones who came up with this. And it revolutionizes, all kinds of manufacturing across the world, not just here. So it's referred to as the American system of production because it was our people who came up with the concept of interchangeable parts. But it goes back to Eli Whitney. We think of him as just inventing the cotton gin, but he's really the one who kind of came up with this concept and began to perfect it over the next couple of decades. But along with this kind of stuff, you also have a labor movement because people don't like what they're getting paid. They don't like their working conditions. We start to have strikes taking place. We begin to have people organizing into unions, which were considered to be illegal. So you were committing a crime if you joined a union. And almost all the laws in this time period favored management. It was very, very difficult for workers to organize and get any type of support from anybody. I'm not going to go into all of that. This whole new market revolution leads to what we now think of as pretty much the class structure we still have. An upper class, which already existed anyway, but a separate middle class, but now not just the poor, because they weren't all poor, but they were the working class. And the working class is always looked down upon because they're considered dirty, uneducated. Whether or not it's true, that's the stereotype. And that really develops and becomes more defined in this particular time period. One of the interesting things for me when I first studied this was this whole concept of the cult of domesticity. You guys are being raised in a time period where, when I was a kid, it was still pretty typical to have husband, wife, kids, and the wife didn't work, and the husband was the breadwinner, and the wife stayed home and took care of the family. That's how I was raised. My mother never worked. My mother didn't even drive. She never had a driver's license. She stayed home, she fed us, she clothed us, she smacked us around when we were bad. She kept us quiet so my dad could, when he was home, he could relax, It's a very different world today. But this whole concept of the mother being the keeper of the home and the husband being the breadwinner, it really starts here. It's not been around forever like people tend to think, because before that, most of the time, husbands and wives had to work together. Whether it was farming or whatever they were doing. Now, they might have had some different tasks that they did, but it was more of a partnership. Partnership in labor, not partnership in the sense that they were equal. The husband was still always, the head. But this kind of, women actually embraced this. Today we may think, why would any woman want to do that? But in this time period, women embraced it because it defined a role for them. It made them the queen of their little universe. And they liked that. They liked having an area that they were considered to be kind of boss over. Now, the husband still could come home and smack her around if he wanted to. He's allowed to do that because, she's the wife and he's the husband. But it gave her some sense of authority and power and prestige, in the rest of the world. Because if she could be a wife that stayed at home, that also says something about their economic status. And that image, which starts kind of in the 1820s, 1830s, gets carried up right until, women started burning their bras in the 1960s, right? Women embraced it to begin with, and then they get to the point where they're like, no, I'm more than just your little housewife. I want something different than that. Now, again, I'm not saying one's bad or one's good, just the transition that takes over 100 years before we kind of go full circle from women thinking this is the best thing since sliced bread to women absolutely hating this. I have two nieces, they're twins. They actually just turned 30. One of them got married 2 years ago and then had a baby. And it's kind of nice when it's in that order too. But anyway, they don't have much money. And she would love to just stay home and just be, mommy and wifey. Has really no great ambitions or desire to do anything other than that. And then my other niece, who just got engaged, she's 30 years old. I don't think she's ever held a full-time job for longer than like 2 months. And she's getting married in May, and unless he kicks her out the door and makes her go get a job, she'll never work. And I don't know where they came from. I don't know how they're related to me. I cannot imagine doing that.
Maybe they were switched at birth with my husband and his sister, 'cause I swear my sister-in-law is the same way. Like, get a job.
I know. I just am like, and again, if families can make that happen and if financially it works for them and everything, I mean, that's fine. I mean, I don't really care, but I just don't get the mentality of just living your whole life hoping that you're going to be able to get married so that you never have to work and you can just stay home and take care of kids. I don't understand that.
I don't mind staying home as long as I have something else to do and like can afford to do it.
Yeah.
I could volunteer easily
I would
at
never
the
depend
school.
on somebody.
What?
I would never depend on somebody like that.
But
But isn't it kind of scary? Because look at all the women that are like my age, because I'm in my 50s now, so women my age whose husbands are like deciding that they're old and fat and they don't want to be with them anymore,
yeah.
and they just leave, and then if that woman has never had an education, a job, or never had to, support herself, what is she supposed to do now? Wouldn't that, I mean, you're talking about being that dependent on somebody, that'd be really scary.
Ever since I graduated high school, I've had 2 jobs. I've worked 60 hours a week. I couldn't imagine not working.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it.
Somebody's been married that long, never been in the job market at all, has no skills whatsoever. Where do you
Yeah,
start?
who's gonna look at them?
Yeah, no, but
I know.
especially now.
Well, even like mothers that stay out of work for longer than a year when they try to go, or even fathers, because I know stay-at-home fathers. Like, once you're out of work for a certain amount of time, then you have to like explain why you've been out of work, and people don't wanna hear, well, I was a stay-at-home mom, or I was a stay-at-home
Yeah.
dad, because they want the person that's even right out of school ahead of you, because you're now 2 years older, and you haven't done anything for 2 years.
Right, I know.
There's probably already 10 people working there who have kids and work and go to school and
Yeah.
everything else. It's like a big deal. Why can't you? It's crazy. Yeah, if you don't have any job history, I have friends that just got out of school with masters and they don't have any job history. They went to school full time and they're having a hell of a time finding a job with a master's.
Yeah.
Or-
Well, my son is, supposedly, he's so funny. He's been, like,
The golden boy?
yeah, 3 weeks now he's been, like on the straight and narrow, trying to, and he said to me the other night, I don't know if you can tell, but a switch has been thrown in my head and I'm a different person. I was like, trying really hard not to laugh, like
How long now? Days?
3 weeks.
3 weeks?
Yeah, which is really long for him. Usually nothing he does lasts more than a week, so this has been 3 weeks.
How old is he?
23. And, he is still young. I don't expect him to, be,
My brother is just not getting his crap together. He's 35 years old. 2 years ago, I convinced him to go back to school. And the boy he's a genius. He looks at something and it sticks. I mean, but
yeah.
for 33 years of his life, he depended on his wife working and the girlfriends that he lived with,
Well, the thing is that my son is trying to depend on us, and I'm like, no, that ain't gonna happen.
My brother did that too. He depended on my mom.
Yeah, he's got to figure out I mean, like you said, you've held 2 jobs, worked 60 hours a
I
week.
don't live with my dad right now, but I live with him in class, and I help him pay rent.
I mean, I wouldn't even necessarily care if he lived with me, if he was supporting himself, contributing, doing something productive with his life. But you're not going to live with me and sleep till noon every day and not do anything around my house.
I could never sleep till noon. I don't think I've ever slept until noon. I don't understand.
I'm not necessarily opposed to people sleeping in every now and then, but when you're not supporting yourself and you're just sleeping till noon every day and staying up to all hours of the night and not trying to find a job, why am I letting you do that in my house? Doesn't make sense to me. Anyway.
You need to institute the Lowell's Mill laws at your house.
Exactly. Anyway, that's kind of all I was going to cover in that section. Let's look at chapter 12 stuff quickly. Obviously, there's, a bunch more information that's in the textbook and everything on this, but like I said, we're trying to cover 2 chapters. I'm just kind of trying to hit the high points.
Are we doing a quiz over these 2 chapters also?
Good question. Actually, your quiz is going to be over 9 and 10, and we covered 9 last week. So 10 we just covered. So your quiz that's due next Tuesday is over 9 and 10. Then the next week the quiz will be, or the next, won't be due next week, but the following week it'll be over 11 and 12 because we're going to cover that.
Is that the week before Thanksgiving?
Mhm.
Oh, no, I'll be there. I'm like,
Except.
the week of Thanksgiving, I won't be.
This is the first section. There's a lot of touchy-feely stuff in this chapter, so not my favorite, but some of you might think it's cool. There's some, art stuff and literature stuff. Edgar Allan Poe's pretty cool. I don't know if you've ever had to read any of his stuff. Anyway, so it just kind of talks about some of the unique American writers, because we didn't really have much of our own culture. We tended to rely on the culture coming over from Europe, but now we're starting to develop our own art, our own literature, kind of our own sense of who we are as Americans, which is kind of scary if you think Edgar Allan Poe is the example of that. So anyway, this first section talks about that. This part I think is kind of cool. You have these different utopian communities that set themselves up, kind of like little communes, trying to have like the perfect little world where we all live together and sing Kumbaya together every night and share our meals and stuff. But none of them ever lasted. I wonder why.
Not
Since you're
practical.
from Cincinnati, did you ever go to the Shaker Village in Kentucky?
Yeah,
That was like every kid in Kentucky had to go there on a field trip. It was crazy.
yeah. It is pretty cool though to
Yeah,
kind of
it's
see
really neat.
what they did there. But the Shakers are so funny because because they believe in celibacy. I mean, most of us, when it comes to religion, most of us are what we're taught as kids, right? Generally speaking, if you stick with a religion, it's probably what you were raised with. Now, some people do change, but most of the time, it's what they were raised with. Well, if you believe in celibacy, then you don't have kids. So if you don't have kids, how do you win converts to your religion? So you can see why the Shakers had a hard time developing much of a community because, someone comes and says, wow, you guys seem like you're pretty cool. You like to shake a lot. They danced a lot and stuff. That's pretty cool. Let's do that. And then, you start saying, well, tell me more about your religion and stuff. And then they talk about what they believe in and everything. And then they say, oh, yeah, and by the way, we're all celibate. Boom! Everybody's out the door. I mean, who wants to do that? If you join us, you can't have sex for the rest of your life. Oh, yeah, thanks. I'd love to do that. So wasn't, too easy to get them. And then then you got the Mormons, which, anybody in here a Mormon? Because you have the Shakers who are celibate, and then you have the Mormons who have sex with everybody. So, no, I'm just kidding. I do have Mormon relatives, and I really do have a lot of respect for them. But polygamy was something that they believed in, and as you guys have seen, what is that show? Sister Wives or something like that?
That show amazes me. I'm like, they all get along and they share the same, I'm like, how does this happen?
Yeah, it'd be interesting to know if they really do all get
Yeah,
along.
they really do get along. And gross. Like, too
How do you
gross.
share the same?
Yeah, exactly.
And how was that conversation with their dad? Does he have to go and ask for their permission every time he's going married someone? It's like, all right, number 4. Number 4.
So you have the Shakers who are celibate, you have the Mormons who practice polygamy, and then you have the Oneida community, my very favorite. They have highly regulated group sexual activity.
Oh, okay.
Now, I don't know how they did this, but every time I think of this, I think of a great big bed
Ew.
with lots of people in it, and little people on both sides of the bed with little ref uniforms on with whistles. And somebody does something that's not acceptable, you blow the whistle and call a foul, and there's some kind of penalty. Somebody has to get out of the bed or something. Don't know. But anyway, they were a very interesting community. Of course, in this time period, they had lots of people probably that secretly wanted to be part of the community, but yet, would just criticize them and say how horrible they were. But they're the same community to this day. Any of you have any Oneida dishes or Oneida utensils at home? If you look at your silverware, there's an awful lot of our silverware is still coming from the Oneida company. That's how they supported themselves, is they made dishes and utensils and sold them, and that's how they were able to support their community. But these are all kind of, people kind of figuring out culturally what worked for them, what didn't work for them, people that were sort of bending the rules, pushing the envelope when it came to societal norms. A lot of that stuff was going on in the 1800s. You also have a whole new Great Awakening going on in this period. Some of it because of these other things that are happening, as the religious people are getting nervous about the craziness that's going on in society, and there's this backlash to that. The people who ended up becoming the Seventh-day Adventists were originally called the Millerites, and they actually had, there's discrepancies as to what year this was. I mean, I'm sure that was one specific year, but there seems to be historical sources say one or the other, so I'm not sure which one's correct. But they actually had figured out that Jesus was returning. The rapture was going to take place on October 22nd, and it was either 1843 or 1844, so they all gathered on a hilltop to wait for him. And apparently he stood them up. So they came back down off the hilltop, and they had to say, okay, we made a mistake. Obviously, we calculated wrong, and they had to kind of go back and redo their theology to figure out what they had done wrong, and that group ended up becoming today what we call the Seventh-day Adventists. I don't understand enough about their religion to say much more than that. If anybody in here is Seventh-day Adventist, you might be able to shed some light on that, but that original group is what became the group that we have today. But this time period also leads to a lot of social reform movements, people seeing problems in society and wanting to do something about them. And one of those issues in this time period was alcohol. I don't know what you think as individuals, but alcohol is always an issue in our society, especially when we hear of drunk drivers and people getting killed and things like that. I come from a very religious background, and so I grew up not drinking at all. It was completely taboo in our church and our family. I think I probably have told you I never even had a drink of alcohol till I was 23 years old, so I went through the whole teenage, early 20s without ever even drinking, period. It just wasn't even important to me to do that. I was also one of those people that I hated to be out of, to not have control. And so to be drunk or to be high was like no, I don't even want to go there because I don't know
What could happen?
Yeah, and how
do.
embarrassed, I mean, am I going to do something that I'm going to be embarrassed about for the rest of my life? I have seen some, I mean, probably not nearly as much as most people, but I have seen some people really just, I cannot believe the behavior that you'll see sometimes in bars and stuff. And I'm like, really? I always, and keep in mind, I'm in my 50s, and I think, what if that was my daughter? How would I feel if I walked into a bar and my daughter was doing what I see that girl doing?
And wearing.
My friend almost like had a concussion. Like her best friend beat her up so bad that both of her black eyes were so swollen. Like they were out to here. They didn't go away for like 3 weeks. But she was completely the girl that my best friend got beat up. And like every time she like tried to hit the girl, she would fall backwards because she was so drunk. I wasn't there, but from what I like heard, I mean it's just crazy how much.
But we think people drink a lot today. But if you look back in this time period, in 1830, the per capita drinking of hard liquor, 7 gallons per person a year. Today, it's actually less than this now. It's only 2.3. I looked it up today. Now, keep in mind, when they do this, they try to do it, like today, they do it based on 14 years and older. 14.
years.
Yeah.
I believe that.
So they say today that it's 2.3. Now keep in mind, probably most 14-year-olds aren't drinking 2.3 gallons of alcohol a year. So that means we have some people drinking a whole lot more than 2.3 gallons, and then you have, other people that maybe drink a half a gallon a year. It's not that much, but they're trying to spread this out on an average across all of society, and they base it on 14 years old. So they're assuming that most 14-year-olds or most teenagers are drinking. And I could tell you that my son was drinking by the time he was 14. And I don't know how, because it sure wasn't in our house. I mean, we had some alcohol in our house, but very, very little.
Kids are crafty when it comes to that kind of stuff.
I know.
Figure it out.
I don't know.
The water in the bottle.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we were pretty stupid, because I just didn't think at that age that they were even doing that kind of stuff yet, but apparently they were. So alcohol was a significant problem. One of the main reasons is because it was mostly a problem for men, because it was more acceptable for men to drink than for women to drink. And the laws regarding domestic abuse just didn't exist. So a husband was allowed legally to beat up his wife. And he tended to do it more often when he was drunk. So the pressure to reduce alcohol consumption came from women, especially, trying to deal with the issue of being beat up, and also the fact that their husbands were spending all the money that he earned on alcohol as opposed to taking care of the family. So the big movement was what's referred to as temperance. To temper something means to, like soften it, to bring it down. So they're trying to temper the use of alcohol. And it was actually extremely significant. These women would, I mean, think about this. Trying to think of a good example. I'm not really thinking of something. But these women, grandma, wife, daughters, would all sit in front of the bars, the taverns that the husbands tended to go to, and just sit there and read a book or knit or something. And so the husbands had to walk into the bar past their mothers and wives and daughters to go get drunk. And they wouldn't say anything. They would just sit there. And I think it got to the point that, especially with men and their moms sitting there, the idea of walking into a bar and just getting crazy drunk and having to come back out and your mother sitting there seeing you like that, it really began to take a toll. The men were just like, I can't drink in there with my mom sitting out there or my grandmother sitting out there. So it starts to make a difference. And then we actually had states begin to pass laws against, alcohol consumption. So they were able to reduce it. Does it say in here?
2 gallons. That second paragraph.
Yeah. Down to 2 gallons per person, from 7 gallons to 2 gallons. I mean, that's huge. the difference that this movement made in that particular time period. And I was looking at the averages over since then, and it really hasn't changed that much. It's never gotten over 3 since then. The highest it was in the late 70s and early 80s. It got up to 2.76. And it was like 2.1 in the 90s. And then it started to climb again to 2.2 and then 2.3 now. But it's never been anything close to what it was before the temperance movement. So kind of interesting. If you ever go to Boston, I'm not going to remember what it's called, but there's a museum there. It's a very small museum. It doesn't take long at all to go through it, but it's pretty cool because it actually, most of these guys, William Morton, Oliver Wendell Holmes, they all were tied to Boston in this time period. So they talk about the kind of the revolution in medicine in the 1840s having to do with anesthetics, so that you could put somebody to sleep when you're going to do surgery. I mean, it used to be you just gave them a bunch of whiskey and tied them down, literally tied them down so that you could cut them open. So this really began to change things. The other thing was this whole idea of Oliver Wendell Holmes he wasn't the one who came up with the theory, but he began to spread the theory of germs and bacteria and how it leads to disease and death and everything else. And he was a doctor, and he used to go into the hospital in Boston where the women would be brought that were going to have children that were poor. So it was like a dirty, kind of nasty hospital, but all the poor women were there, and he went there to try to help them. But the women would just be lined up in beds in a great big room. So there might be 30 women in this room that were all getting ready to give birth. And the doctors would just start at one end and, examine the woman actually putting their hand up inside of them and check things out and stuff. And a nurse would be standing there, and they'd wipe off their hand on the rag, go to the next woman, no washing, no nothing, do the same thing with that woman, wipe their hand off on the same rag that's now got all kinds of stuff on it, do the whole room of 30 women, and then did not understand why most of those women died in childbirth. Had no idea that they were just taking bacteria from one person to the next.
How would you like to be the last one?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
guess you were hoping to be the first.
I know. Start on this side.
Good.
Even our president, James Garfield, I don't know if you guys knew this, but James Garfield was shot, and the bullet was not all that deep. I forget what part of his body he was shot in. Really should have been something that they could have just taken the bullet out and, cleaned it up and everything. But, he's the president of the United States, and he gets shot, so all the doctors in town, come flocking there. Oh, let me examine him, all the big egos that doctors tend to have. And so he was examined by many doctors, I forget the number. Every single one of them sticks their finger in the wound, never washed their hands, never did anything, probes around in there and everything. Finally, somebody decides to do something. I don't remember if they took the bullet out or what. And he died. And he died because of the infection, not because of the bullet. But you got, 8, 10 different doctors sticking their dirty hands inside this wound. Anyway, it took us forever to figure this out. Even though this is in the 1840s, it's not until the 1880s that, generally speaking, doctors accepted the fact that you needed to have sterile instruments and sterile hands to be able to work on a patient.
And until today, they still have, this problem of washing their hands. If you go to the doctor's office, many times, if you don't wash them or tell them, to remind them, to wash them, and sometimes they won't.
Yeah. I don't know, they just don't take it very seriously. Education, big changes in education in this period. Horace Mann is considered kind of the father of education, mainly because of trying to come up with you guys familiar today with the expression Common Core? We're hearing it all over the place now. Not always a good thing. I mean, I think there's good aspects to it. Makes me a little nervous with some of the directions that it's going. But in some ways, that's what Horace Mann was doing, because there was no uniform system of education in this country. So a kid who went to school in Connecticut would get a completely different education than a kid that went to school in another state. And there weren't any standards. And teachers were not valued at all. That's really changed a lot, hasn't it? But anyway, Horace Mann was the first to kind of come up with a uniform curriculum. All students that are in 4th grade here should be doing the same kind of stuff, as they are over here. Training for teachers. They didn't have any training. You just picked some young woman that in your community that hadn't found a husband yet and stuck her in the classroom, whether or not she had any education. So we begin to start seeing actual training for teachers, curriculum that was geared toward certain ages, all of those kinds of things. And he's the first to really begin to do that. Noah Webster, the Webster Dictionary, it goes all the way back to him. He pretty much wrote textbooks for kids, but also wrote our first American dictionary. Because remember, we were still kind of using English stuff, but we were talking differently here in America. So, it was kind of like, wait a minute, we really need to have a dictionary that corresponds with the way we speak, not the way they speak back over there. Any of you ever seen the McGuffey Readers? See, again, I didn't grow up on McGuffey Readers, but my parents did. So we had a couple in our household. I don't know what happened to them. They seem to have disappeared. But did you guys grow up on like standard readers when you were like 1st grade, 2nd grade? Did they have certain characters? Do you remember what they were?
Sue and Sam.
Sue and Sam.
And were a boy and a girl, and then there was like a dog and a cat that had names. I can't remember them.
So was McGuffey like the old Dick and Jane stuff? That's what it was?
That's what I was going to get at.
Yeah.
I grew up on Sally, Dick, and Jane, and Spot the dog.
Spot the dog.
Yeah, I don't know if they had a cat, but they had Spot the dog. And I remember run, Spot, run, jump, Spot, jump. Those were some of the first things I learned to read. And Sally was this little, like, kindergarten kind of age little girl that was, Dick was the oldest, and then Jane, and then Sally. And Sally had real blonde hair. And when I was that young, I had real blonde hair. So I used to think I was Sally, and I played out in the yard with my dog Spot. See, I remember all that stuff. Anyway, also another thing, in terms of prison reform, because prisons back then, it used to be you sent people to prison for debt. Then they stopped doing that eventually. They were like, that just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And they also sent all the mentally insane to prisons. Or just the mentally ill, not even necessarily like insane, but just people who had mental problems. And they kind of figured out maybe that wasn't really humane to do that. So we begin to see some changes in how prisons themselves are treated and also who we send there. And Dorothea Dix was one of the first to really address the issue of the mentally ill and how we take care of them, and just, looking at them as human beings and trying to treat them with respect even though they're not normal. And so major changes took place because of her travels and her pleas with the government. Especially, she was in Massachusetts, but because of what she did there, it led to, again, if you know anything about state asylums in the 1800s and 1900s, they still were not good places. But it was better than just putting them in a prison with criminals, so that we were moving towards something more humane, even though they were still pretty horrible places. Women's movement begins to take off in this period, but as you know, I mean, women still didn't get the right to vote until 1920. It really is pretty interesting. I mean, seriously, if you think about it, as much as we thought blacks were not even human, right? That they're slaves, they're not even really human. But the men of this country, the men who had the opportunity to vote and make laws and make decisions in this country, were more willing to give ex-slaves the right to vote than they were women. Blacks in this country, black males in this country, at least legally, I realize there's lots of other issues, but legally got the right to vote in 1870. And women did not get the right to vote for another 50 years. What does that tell you about the way men thought about women?
Well, that's not like numbers.
I mean, it was like absurd to them that a woman would have any say in government whatsoever. But yet, a person that they didn't even think of as a person, they'll give them the right to vote. Doesn't even compute.
The
And-
temperance movement helped start prohibition before they could even vote, so they basically got alcohol, helped get alcohol voted out before they could even vote. That's crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, it was right after, but still.
Yeah, I know. Well, and a lot of that, the reason why, I think, the reason why Prohibition was passed had a lot to do with World War I. Because what do you make alcohol out of?
Corn.
Grain, right? Different corn, grain, different things like that, which was needed for food during World War I. So even though Prohibition didn't go into effect until World War I had just ended, the process of it, a lot of the push by women was pushing the idea that we need that product for food to be able to feed our soldiers. And how do you not do that if you're at all patriotic? So if World War I had not happened at the same time, I don't know that Prohibition would have ever passed. But that's my opinion. But the women's movement itself is kind of officially considered to have started in 1848 at a convention that the leading women of our country held. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, very important women in the early stages of this movement, even though most of these women at this point would not have lived long enough to have seen the 19th Amendment, but they pretty much laid the foundation for it. And then abolitionism becomes important in this period. It starts as early as the early 1800s, but a lot of people, even people who wanted blacks to be freed, did not necessarily want them to live next door. So it was like, yeah, let's free them, but let's send them back to Africa. And of course the blacks are saying, but we didn't come from Africa. Our family has lived here for 200 years. We don't really want to go someplace we've never been before. So that didn't necessarily work as well as they had hoped. The country of Liberia was actually established in 1822 to give free blacks a place to go and live and have their own community. But most people here, anyway, did not really have any desire to go to Africa. They wanted to be able to be free here. William Lloyd Garrison, very important name in the history of abolition. He is a white man that just believed very, very strongly that blacks were human, that blacks should have the same rights as any other person in this country, and that there should be no gradual emancipation. If you're human, you're human. You should be free today, not in 10 years or 5 years, or if I can buy my freedom. It just was all ridiculous to him that we even had those kind of conversations. And he fought for 30 years to try to bring about emancipation of slavery in this country. Risked his life and was attacked many times, had his, he was a newspaper editor, and he put out a newspaper that constantly was pushing for the abolition of slavery. So extremely important figure to this, that just continually, no matter what they threw at him, he was not going to stop speaking out against slavery. Now he's white, remember. He's a little short, bald, dorky looking white guy that you would think, I mean, the guy's tiny. He could, you know, you could just push him and he'd fall over. And, you know, he has the courage of a lion. And then you've got Frederick Douglass, who had been a slave, had gained his freedom, goes on and gets an education. He also publishes a newspaper, gets involved in politics. So from a white, dorky kind of educated guy to a guy who has actually experienced slavery, knows what it's like, and fights against slavery as well. But Frederick Douglass understands that he has to play the game differently. Garrison can get away with some stuff that a black guy isn't going to be able to get away with. So Frederick Douglass sometimes is criticized for not pushing hard enough. But he has to play it differently. I mean, you can't exactly hide being black. It's a little tough. So, I give the guy a lot of credit. I mean, he navigated his way through a society and just made a huge difference. So I have the full respect for him. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Lincoln said to her when he met her, he blames her for the Civil War, right? So you're the little lady that has brought on this great war. Because he knew that her book got to the hearts of the average American in a way that nothing any politician would ever say could do. She pulled at their heartstrings, and she got a lot of people to get off the fence and to realize slavery it's wrong, it's inhumane, and we shouldn't tolerate it in this country. How many of you have seen the movie Amistad? Just one? Did you see it because you wanted to, or was it a class thing?
It was a class thing.
It's actually a good movie. They could take 30 minutes out of it and it would still be good. But it tells the story of a slave ship that ended up here in the States kind of by accident, and how some abolitionists tried to fight for the freedom of those people, to say that they should never have been brought here, because after 1808 it was illegal to bring Africans here directly from Africa to the United States, because we had made that illegal. So they tried to claim that these slaves had been slaves in Cuba and that they were just being transported from Cuba. And so since they had already been slaves, it was okay for them to come here, which wasn't true. They were actually directly from Africa. So this lawyer had to prove that they hadn't come from Cuba, but they had come from Africa, and by proving that, he could show that it was a violation of the 1808 law. So anyway, it's a Steven Spielberg movie. I mean, it's actually well done from a dramatic standpoint and everything else. Again, they made it a little bit too long. I think there's parts of it they could have cut out, and it still would have been a very good movie. So if you ever get a chance to see it, it's in the past, and I may do this again in the future, I've actually used that as, instead of doing like the paper that you did on Indian removal, I've had students watch this movie and then respond to questions about the case and the movie and everything else. So I've used it before in my classes. Anyway, there's stuff I didn't go over, but that's kind of the main points of what's in these two chapters. Again, as you can see, we didn't really talk about in this year this happened, this year. It's kind of all of this stuff is happening in that period from about 1820 up to 1850. Chapter 11 specifically talks about slavery and how slavery has become more entrenched in our country in the 1800s, which is going to lead us to the Civil War as one of the major factors in that. And then we kind of get back chapters 13, 14, 15 being more chronological, kind of picking up where we left off before and taking us up through the Civil War. So, but 11 is still kind of more of a topical chapter that deals specifically with slavery, how it became so entrenched in the South, and how it starts to lead to those divisions between North and South. All right? So, I think I posted an announcement. What's due next week? You have two things due next week, right? A discussion board and your quiz over 9 and 10. So you have a quiz over chapters 9 and 10. Remember, it's not over the two chapters we just covered. It's over Jackson, and then it's over the market revolution. And then the following quiz will be over slavery, and then over this social reform, movement time period. All right? Okay.
For the rest of my life and not talk about Jackson ever again.
Well, it's interesting is, in some ways, he's a very good president. He's probably the first president to really establish himself as a true authority in the country. I mean, Washington had that just because of who he was, but he didn't have to do anything. He just was respected. Jackson's the first to really just kind of exert this presidential authority, and he gets away with it. Congress doesn't really shoot him down. And you're not going to have a president do that again until Teddy Roosevelt. And then you're not going to really have it again until Franklin Roosevelt. Those are kind of the three presidents who really kind of go beyond what's considered the normal role of president in this country. I mean, again, that's my opinion. People could disagree with me, I guess. But those are the three that really stand out to me as kind of, almost like letting the office go to their head a bit and maybe taking it too far. But seemed to work for them. All right, guys. Oh, Kat, I need to see you for a minute. And, I don't know if you guys, I was asked to make this announcement, so give me just a second. Have you guys ever heard about the honors program here at the college?
Yes.
I mean, you can, if you take a certain number of honors classes, you actually graduate with, an honors diploma, which, obviously looks a lot better for you if you go, but you only have to take a certain number of classes. It's like 6 classes have to be honors classes or something. Well, generally speaking, those classes have not been offered here in Palm Bay, and they're trying to begin to offer some of those, and I think in the spring, they're gonna offer general psychology and abnormal psychology as honors classes. And they're usually very small, like 10 students or less. And they're structured very differently. They're, I don't know if you've ever done any kind of seminar or something, but they're more like a seminar format and more discussion oriented and dealing with various topics as opposed to, a teacher just lecturing kind of thing. And Barbara Kennedy, I don't know if any of you know who she is.
I've had her.
She's a very good teacher and she's really fun. And
General Psych too, I had her, she teaches the honors course too.
so anyway, she's going to be teaching, I think both of those courses here, if she told me, if I'm remembering what she told me correctly. So anyway, she just asked me to mention it, that if you have any interest, you don't have to be, well, maybe I'm wrong. I started to say you don't, there is like a little application you have to go through to be in the honors program, but it's not real stringent. And then, you can decide, even after you do that, you can decide, well, I can't really complete it, I'm not going to get all the courses, but if you fill out the application and they accept you, then at least you could take the course, in the spring. But if you like more of a smaller discussion-oriented group, especially in psychology, that's kind of cool, to be able to have that. And she's really a cool teacher. I mean, she's one of my best friends, but from what I've heard from students.
I loved having her.
Yeah, so I've heard the same thing from, most of her students. So anyway, she asked me to mention that to you guys. Because, registration started this week, so you guys are probably thinking about, what you're going to do in the spring.
What?
When it comes to the title, some of you might need your test back. Hello.
For the email, I remember once I tried to email you about a problem I had with my computer. I couldn't get through. I don't know if, something about the name or something. I don't know if there's any.
Well, if you're in here, if you go to communicate, I'm assuming you guys have quick message.
Yeah, you have to find her name within the students.
So if you go quick message and then go to,
Class, you just click class.
Yeah, at the top. Well, she
Go to
did.
source right there.
well, I don't know, in mine, and
It's
then,
That's it right there, yeah, that's the same.
so you can go all course faculty, or you can go here and just put my name in, either
You
one
gotta
of them.
make
remember
sure
if I
that you
had
put,
the-
look, but you gotta make sure.
But then you have to
put
click,
Two buttons.
yeah, you have to click the 2 button so it comes
Yeah,
up here.
yeah, I did. I was looking, for those letters, to see, does it start, by D or L?
Sometimes it comes up under both, depending on what you click on. And then, to attach the file, you just click on that. So you should be okay.
All right, so I'll do that now. Thanks.
All righty. Yours. And if you guys want to see a test to figure out which ones you missed, you can see one, but I don't want you to keep it, so. Do you want to look at one of these before you leave?
So do you add that together? Or is that the total?
The bottom one's the total.
Okay.
Whoops. Shoot, I forgot to give her her test.
Like you erased it too.
Regis. Did you know that you were supposed to do two questions? Because there were 25 point sheets.
And I got like the bottom one.
Yeah, well, you're supposed to do 2 out of 3. So that's
42.
gonna hurt me. But do you, I mean, I don't know how much time you have. Do you want to sit here and write out one of the other ones now, as much as you can remember? Okay. Well, can you, is there a time that you can come in and do it in the office like you did this before? You don't need to tell me now, but if you can,
Yeah, I have to check on work schedule. It may think it'd be sometime early in the morning, sometime later this week or next week.
okay, well,
Early in the morning.
if you'll, call or check with the,
Yeah, I can call Miss Karen or Miss Odd.
yeah, and see if, she can set you up in the conference room or whatever
Yeah.
she did before, and
That'll
we'll,
work. Yeah.
but I kind of figured you must have not realized that you're supposed to
Yeah,
do both
I
of them.
thought it was pick one, I'm sorry about that.
No, that's okay, I just don't want you to not get any points for it, so,
All right, yeah, I'll call them and set it up.
okay,
Thank you.
all righty.
Shoot. Alright, listen, I didn't do the, well, I did it, but I didn't do all of it. I lost my flash drive today. I think someone robbed my car, to be completely honest with you, because I park in the back of Subway and we work. I don't know if you know where Babcock is. So, what I did is I had to pay someone $20 to come in for an hour for me, so I can leave early. I'm not kidding you. Because then she would go over 40 or whatever. So I ran to the library.
You keep this.
Yeah, that's fine. And I did as much as I could, but this is all I got done in 2 hours.
Well, can you finish it and send it to me by email?
Yeah. I just don't know how long you're gonna give me. Because you see, I'm almost halfway done. I just have to cite it and all the other fun stuff. But, I have to give someone $20 tomorrow.